Thanks very much, Luke. I'm not sure about the choice of words there about descending into the final session. I would have liked to have thought of this was the culmination of the conference. So I thought I would start my observations by sort of looking backwards and then look forwards into the future. I've been in this game nearly 10 years now, first at Orca and then at TEQSA. So me and my colleagues and I, who are all team leaders or group leaders, have handled a large number of cases, individual cases. And case management, I should say at the beginning also, is a term that has two meanings, which sometimes leads to a bit of confusion. So your case manager, we often think of your case manager as the person who is your principal contact at TEQSA, who you can go to ask questions about any particular matter. But in addition to that, there are individual assessments, and there may be a particular staff member assigned to assess that particular case, who may not be your normal case manager in the sense of account manager or principal contact. So there is a little bit of ambiguity about that phrase, which we're hoping to clarify going forward. But if we think about not so much about the account manager side of things, but about the handling and assessment of individual cases, extending back over the last 10 years and beyond. So what are the recurring issues that we can observe over that period? If we look in the publication that we issued earlier in the year, Assessment Insights, which analyses the findings of TEQSA assessments over that time, there's an interesting graph which presents which are the areas where TEQSA has imposed the most number of conditions or has had the most number of adverse findings. And it's interesting that the area where there have been the most number of adverse findings has been governance. Now, in a way, that's logical. Governance is the most important directing function in an organisation. And there's the phrase that was referred to yesterday in one of Hillary's session, the fish rots from the head. So if there are problems, they may originate at the top. On the other hand, there's a very defined focus in the standards on student outcomes and the student life cycle. So why doesn't that figure more prominently in the findings that TEQSA makes, the adverse findings or the sanctions that TEQSA applies? Well, it does figure very prominently in the findings, and often the issues that we observe do originate in the student life cycle. The student life cycle obviously includes admissions issues, potentially. Do the other students being admitted according to the defined criteria, are they capable, are they positioned well enough to undertake the course? Progress, if they are admitted into the course, do they progress or do they not progress? Do they drop out? Do they continue? And finally, the assessment, the final assessment of student outcomes. Do they achieve the learning outcomes that are set for their courses, yes or no? So where problems occur at any stage in that life cycle, problems may occur at any time. I mean, I often say that in any organisation there will be variations in quality. There will never be uniform quality. But the question is, our issue is, how does the organisation address that? How does management and the governing body detect issues that arise and correct them, bring things back on course? And I think this is why where we do impose sanctions, we often impose them on the governing bodies, the academic governing body and the corporate governing body. We hold them accountable. We have observed these issues over a number of years. You haven't fixed them yet. We want you now going forward to fix them. So the governing bodies need to know what is happening in the organisation at each of those stages in the student life cycle, which means they need to have very good reporting of data and information about each of those life cycles to make sure that they're proceeding smoothly. And the fact that the governing body is both receiving this information and acting on it needs to be evident. It needs to be evident to any outside observer, including but not limited to TEQSA. So those are some of the things that we have observed over the last 10 years. So what about going forward? You've heard a number of references to Cycle 2 during this conference. The reason why we're thinking about that is that up until this year, really, every single case of a provider registration, re-registration, or a course re-registration that we were assessing it for the first time. We knew nothing about this course prior. We knew nothing. Well, we hadn't assessed the provider for re-registration before. It was entirely new. So we needed to take an extremely thorough approach to that and assess every unit of the course and every course learning outcome, assess in many cases, every standard applying to re-registration. And over the time, we have gradually moved towards trying to target our assessments more. There are 110 standards that any provider can be subject to. Some of those standards have 10 or 11 requirements inbuilt in them. So we've tried to target our assessments more and more as we go through using now the Core Plus approach. But in Cycle 2, we have another opportunity to target even more because we are now dealing with courses and providers that we have assessed previously. So we can look at, we can use that as the baseline. From our colleagues at the Institution of Engineers, I borrowed the concept of monitoring against the baseline. So in Cycle 1, we established the baseline. We found out whether that course was in good shape or not. We found out whether that provider was in good shape or not. We learnt a lot about it. In Cycle 2, we can see how that course or that provider has tracked over time away from the baseline, hopefully in a favourable direction. So if issues were raised in Cycle 1, have they been settled? Have they been addressed by the provider in Cycle 2? Rather than the international standard tends to be there is a one-size-fits-all approach in every cycle. In every cycle for a course, you get together a panel, they assess every standard that applies to the course in Cycle 1 and produce a massive report. And then in Cycle 2, you repeat. You do exactly the same thing again. You look at every learning outcome of every unit, every component of every unit, just as you did in Cycle 1. Well, we don't want to do that in Cycle 2. We need to take some things as read and really look at how that course has developed over the course of time. We would expect it to have developed. There is, as you know, interim monitoring that should be happening at the end of every semester. And there should also be, obviously, periodic reviews, comprehensive reviews at the end of the cycle undertaken by the provider. And those reviews need to be very, very thorough. And the more we can see that those reviews that undertaken by the provider have been very thorough, the less we need to do, the more confidence we can have that if the course was in good shape last time, it's probably still in good shape this time. It's been updated if necessary. But of course, in some cases, there may have been such a fundamental review of the course that it's essentially either a new course or there are very major new elements in it. So we might need to assess those. So we won't need in Cycle 2 to do a bottom-up assessment of everything of every course. And where providers, in the case of courses, where providers have commissioned external experts, credible external experts to undertake a review of the course and have produced a credible report, we may not need to commission our own experts to do one of those reports. Turning to registration, finally, before I ask my colleagues to comment, how does Cycle 2 apply to registration? Well, again, my favourite question to a governing body when I go on a site visit and I interview them, interview the governing body is, how do you know whether all of your students achieve the learning outcomes set for your courses? and that applies either in general or in particular cohorts of students admitted in a particular way, international students versus domestic students, cohorts of students in different fields of study. How do you know whether all of those students are achieving the learning outcomes of your courses? Is it evident that they are to you, and is it evident to us that you have that you know about that, you are on top of that? And if there are issues, what do you do about it? This is the fundamental question which we can still ask of all governing bodies. So that's the conclusion of my remarks. My colleagues have also had many years of experience. They're all team leaders and group leaders in managing cases and also managing case managers. So I will probably proceed from left to right, if that's okay, and ask Gary Ledson to make a few remarks first.
I thought you were going to ask me a question, Michael, but that's okay.
All right. Well, I do have a question if you want a question. I have a leading question, which is, what does a really good application to TEQSA look like?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, Michael, because that's what I was going to talk about. Kimberly, in the previous session, talked about, within the Microcourses team, looking at working with providers towards having decision-ready applications. We have the similar objective, working with our providers in terms of their compliance with the higher education standards. Prue mentioned the other day a figure which sort of puts some sort of context around this. In Cycle 1, which is coming to a conclusion, in 80% of cases we had to request further information. And overall we found that there were 250 separate requests had been generated by 170 providers. So something's wrong there. We're either asking the wrong question or not providing sufficient advice, or providers in an attempt or a wish to demonstrate compliance with the standards give us everything. But I think the term less is more is important. Personally, I've had experience where dealing with the particular assessments, we've received thousands of documents, in the order of 4,000 in a particular instance. Again, large responses from university in terms of re-registration, 400 odd documents, of which some of them were huge. Board papers, academic board papers, and so on. Now, the task of the assessment manager to actually come to some conclusions on that material is very, very difficult. And I would say it's some of the more complex work that I've done during my working life. So what we do, and the impact of that, more importantly, is the time that assessment managers need to go back to providers. So it's time spent on collecting information which probably should have been provided in the first place. TEQSA has to take some responsibility in that regard. We're not asking or not giving explicit instructions or advice to our providers about how and what sort of information we need. So what we want to do, and that's clearly an emphasis in the current environment in which we're operating and are about to enter in terms of Cycle 2, we know there are huge numbers of assessments that are coming our way. There's a number of strategies that are being used to try and deal with that, but one of the strategies we know that we need to do is to work with the providers to ensure that when submissions are made, that they are of a quality that enables us to move to a decision quickly, more quickly than what we've been doing in the past. So, again, we're reviewing that. We're going to seek some assistance from our stakeholders, our providers, to get particular advice about how an application can be better structured and would suit the individual needs of the provider. So what we are aiming to do is better target the information so that less time can be spent on preparation, in addition to lifting the overall quality of applications, and significantly reduces the time required for the assessment. And that works both ways. It works for the provider. If we can give much clearer directions to the sort of information we need, then the burden is less. Equally, from the TEQSA's point of view, it enables us to more quickly manage the assessment. Now, there's a bit of work to be done, clearly, and we have a range of guidance notes, materials to assist the providers in terms of developing evidence to meet a particular assessment type. And there will have to be further information and guidance to go out to the sector in relation to that. But the ultimate aim is that providers will have a clear understanding of the selection of evidence and how this demonstrates at a very high level how each provider is meeting the standards, which is the way in which TEQSA assesses applications.
Thanks very much, Gary. Over to you, Anne.
Oh, yes, well, good afternoon, everyone. I head up the team. I head up the team that assesses initial registration applications and accreditation applications. And I thought I might just touch on briefly what, over the period of time I've been working in the team, we've identified as quality applications that lead to successful outcomes for the applicant, and hence registration and accreditation course of study. Now, TEQSA is cognizant of the need in some cases, and where it's appropriate, to use consultants, but ultimately it is the applicant's registration application, so they need to own it, and they need to demonstrate owning that through involvement from the ground up. So in looking in the past, we've been concerned where applications have come in and they haven't actually demonstrated that they have been there all the way, or if they have, it's been for a short time of the way. And so it's really important that governing boards get on board, together with the academic boards, the relevant academic committees, the academic leaders, and make that application their own. And in particular, the focus areas are that I talked about a period of time, and we'd like to see that applicants have built that application over a minimum of 18 months, preferably 2 years. So we can really see progress, development, consideration of sustainability, effectiveness. In particular, the capacity of those internal governing bodies, the academic board, the governing body, and the staff, and quality assurance mechanisms are there. Now, TEQSA does understand that new applicants won't be able to show implementation of many policies that are meant to satisfy the standards until they are operational. But what we do look at in quite a significant degree is the development of the course. Now, in particular, that the provider has a clear and cohesive course design, development and review policy, that it has followed that policy in developing its course or courses, that there has been overarching academic scrutiny of the course. Now, that's both internally through the academic board process, the course accreditation committee, or whatever the committee has been developed to develop the course, and most importantly, through seeking independent expert advice and review of that course outside the provider. And I do want to stress that, because that then gives TEQSA confidence that the applicant has the capacity to develop a course that it's taken on the feedback of those experts and built in that feedback and produced a quality course for consideration for accreditation. Another area is that a quality application will show an institutional policy framework that is fit for purpose We do appreciate that we don't expect applicants to reinvent the wheel, but we do believe the policies need to reflect the applicant's proposed course, its strategic plan, its teaching and learning plan, and in particular its workforce plan. So those policies need to be comprehensive and cohesive. Finally, I'd also want to mention another important area we focus on and in terms of a quality application, that the governing board will have determined realistic income projections and student enrolment projections that have taken account of their business model and also the competitive nature of the sector. So in concluding, I think that successful applications have reflected all those characteristics that I've outlined here.
Thanks. Over to you, Gary.
Over to me. I might just start by going back to the question that concluded the last session around a timeliness of response. I think TEQSA, safe to say, we feel we can do better, and we haven't always landed response in a timely manner in the past. I think, for the most part, I hope those have been isolated incidents. I know there have been some. I'm probably responsible for some of them, so I apologise for that. But we have, it's already been alluded to at this conference, that we are undertaking a review of our case management model. Part of that will be ensuring that we can provide consistent and timely advice. And we'll also be ensuring that we establish, we publish and we make public and we hold ourselves to service standards. So all that combined, I hope, will result in overall better quality and more timely response to queries. There's been a number of discussions, both in this panel and the previous, about guidance, and I think if we can improve our guidance earlier, that will also help minimise the questions that need to come through and also ensure there's better guidance out there in the sector. Moving on to I guess some areas of priority at the moment for us, and I look after I guess a number of strands of specialisation in the agency: Microcourses, initial registration, sector assessment and compliance and investigation. And first of all, I just wanted to touch on a lot of the work of the sector assessment team. We really think it's important that the work that we're doing across the agency and across the sector in a thematic context, both we use that as a way to engage and educate the sector, but that information is then built back into the regulatory work that we do. So there's been a lot of discussion over this conference around academic integrity. TEQSA's done a lot of work in that space, and most recently with a number of workshops that have been run across the country. We've also done a lot of work in admissions transparency, and we are currently going through a process of a substantive assessment of providers, and that's focused on the transparency of the information they provide to domestic undergraduate students. We have done that. I think, suffice to say, at this point we don't feel, we were hoping to see greater progress than we have to date. We've still got a long way to go in our assessment, but the recommendations of the Higher Education Standards Panel that were released a couple of years ago, there was a lot of work initially to get up to speed, I guess, and there was still a lot of work to go. And in some areas we feel like that might have flatlined a little bit, and there hasn't necessarily been that continuous improvement at institutions to ensure they continue to work towards implementing those recommendations. And the final point in that space relates to sexual assault and sexual harassment. It's been a topic of discussion for a long time, and it was highlighted and touched on by the Minister's speech earlier today. We will be releasing guidance, a good practice note rather, to the sector very soon. We've been working collaboratively with providers in relation to those that are currently going through regulatory assessments. And from all reports, that's been a very constructive process and a process that's been welcomed by the sector. So we'll continue to do that and release that good practice note. We'll certainly have regard to, and we will reflect carefully on the Supreme Court findings and what that means for the guidance that we provide to the sector. The final area that I wanted to touch on, and I'm not going to talk too much about Microcourses because they've had their time in the sun today, is compliance and investigation. That's also a new area for TEQSA, and it's an area where we have focused, and there was specific support provided to TEQSA to do that. Earlier this year, we made a decision to move non-application-based compliance work away from assessment teams into a dedicated compliance and investigation team. The fact that then some institutions will be receiving inquiries from the compliance and investigation team isn't necessarily an escalation in the first instance. It's purely a reorganisation of how we do that work at TEQSA, and I think that's an important note. Now, part of that will actually free up the assurance group and the assessment teams to get on and deal with the application-based work in a more expedited manner than we've been able to, purely given the load of compliance work. One area of focus that's been well documented has been in English language proficiency, and we are currently engaging with about 10 institutions on that matter. It has been an area of focus for the agency for some time. We've stated publicly that we don't necessarily believe there is some systemic issue that is rampant across the sector or severe failings in this, but it doesn't mean that there aren't significant areas of improvement at the same time. And in engaging with providers, and we've engaged with certainly all the providers that were named in the Four Corners episode earlier this year, plus others, I really want to take the time to commend the work of the University of Tasmania to get on the front foot when an issue is presented, to engage independent external advice, to look at what they're doing and then be transparent about management's response. So it's something that I think has been certainly refreshing, and I know they're not the only institution that do that, but it does give TEQSA a lot of confidence when institutions are prepared to accept or at least reflect that there may be issues that could be improved. And it's something that we would, I think, hope to see more of as we engage with the sector on this and other topics moving forward.
Thanks, Gary. Since you have the floor, there's a bit of a segue into one of the questions that have come through, which is about Microcourses forms. Will we be making available samples of the Microcourses forms on the TEQSA portal? Currently, if you select a form for the purpose of looking up what information is required rather than making an application at that time, the portal doesn't really lend itself to that. So.
Sure. Look, that's been a piece of priority work for the team, and Kim spoke earlier about the lean work. The team has now completed, I think, a review of all or almost all forms and guidance, and we're currently finalising that, and hopefully, if not later this year, early in the new year, we'll be releasing those forms, releasing the guidance and updating the website. So we'll certainly take that on notice. I can't speak exactly if we do have sample forms available, but it seems eminently sensible, and I can't see any reason why we wouldn't do that.
Thanks. So there's another question about poor provider that's had approximately 8 case managers since 2014, and it's really about the churn, if you like, or the turnover, the frequent turnover of case managers in the past few years, and whether this is going to continue. This would be, I understand, this would be very frustrating. I think it's a legacy issue or a historical issue that dates back to the time when our budgets were cut, and we were very heavily reliant on temporary contractors. And there was a very high level of staff attrition, which has now improved greatly. So in the second half of 2018, we basically rebuilt our core of staff, which had previously been much depleted. So I think going forward, you're not going to see the same level of turnover of case managers that you have done recently. Now, the next one, I think, there's a question from Michael Milgate who asked if Anne can discuss the use of consultants to actually create courses and how this is perceived. So where the course design has been done, has been outsourced essentially to consultants. How do we approach that as a scenario, and what does that tell us?
Well, as I said, we don't necessarily have a problem with using consultants. With the course, using a consultant for developing the course, we would still then have to go through and see that the provider has, in fact, applied its own internal quality assurance mechanisms. So by that I mean that if that they've followed their policy, and the policy, they've implemented the policy, I should say, that there's been that academic overarching scrutiny by the academic board, and more importantly, in the case of the consultant, that the consultant has provided that course to the course Accreditation or Development Committee for consideration. So I'm thinking about this off the top of my head, but one thing that we would be looking for is the terms of reference for the consultant to develop that course, and following on from that, how the Course Accreditation Committee has assessed the consultants, what they've come up with. So it's not necessarily, we wouldn't want to see an applicant buying a course off the shelf, so to speak. So it really would, as I said, we need to see that there's the capacity within the organisation to develop the course.
Yeah, I think that's, in a way, that's the key. I think one of the greatest tests of an applicant's capability is the ability to develop a strong course or some strong courses. And if all of that is outsourced, and potentially all of the development of policies and procedures is outsourced, it raises a question in our mind. Does this organisation have the capability going forward to operate as a higher education provider and to create a rich learning environment for students? So that is the underlying issue that we would be concerned about. There is a beginnings of a question by Ursula Frank, but the question doesn't seem to have transpired. Is Ursula here? Perhaps would like to make that question in the ask that question in the microphone? If not, we might pass on to the next one. There's a question about what our approach is to innovation in the sector. This is quite an important question. Would one of my colleagues like to answer that? Gary, you want to take that one on?
Sure. Look, I think we see innovation in the sector all the time. It's part of the objects of the Act. Innovation is certainly named in that, so it's certainly something we recognise. I think a lot of the changes that we're making, particularly about timeliness, will assist us to better contribute towards bringing innovative products to the market, particularly in the course accreditation space. We've seen substantial improvements in TEQSA's timeliness around course accreditation, and it has been an area of focus for that very reason, that unlike a renewal approach, bringing new courses, new initial registrations to market contributes towards an innovative and dynamic sector. So we think it's really important. We welcome it. We appreciate that at times, also when we engage our own external experts to review courses, at times some of the feedback might be along the lines of this is not traditional or it's not normal, and we've seen that. That doesn't mean it doesn't meet the standards, and there's certainly been lots of examples at TEQSA where there might have been some adverse feedback from an expert around the nature of particularly a course development, when we've been able to look at that and go, well, yeah, that it may not be normal or it may not be typical, but it doesn't mean it doesn't meet the standards. And that goes to the point that we've been discussing a number of times throughout this day of the importance and the emphasis that we want to place on providers to engage their own independent, credible experts, because you will be in a good position to determine who you can engage that will best understand your context and best be able to contribute towards providing you with credible, independent expert advice to inform your decision-making, whatever that will be.
Yeah, I suppose I would just put a caveat on that. We also see cases where there are courses presented to us which are clearly deficient under any interpretation of the standards. And we point these out, and the dual experts point this out, and the answer comes back, oh yes, but we're taking an innovative approach. So it can be a bit of an excuse, but if there is a really convincing rationale for that different course design or course structure, of course we are happy to accept it, but sometimes there isn't, so there's a bit of a caveat to that. Now, there is a question from Leanne Midgley, which is going off the bottom of the screen. So can we get Leanne to ask her question to the microphone, please?
Thanks. I was just wondering if the response to the previous question regarding outsourcing of course development applied also to the development of short courses or micro courses?
I think if I can answer that, I mean, if an institution wants to develop a micro-credential and it's not an award course or it's not an accredited course of study, then that's not something that TEQSA would have regulatory oversight over. So I'm not sure whether that would be a space that we would actually have any visibility of, and nor would we have any need to engage in that process. So I don't think we have any concerns if short courses are developed or micro-credentials are developed and they're not award courses, so to speak. We wouldn't necessarily have visibility or a need to be involved in that process. But Michael, you may wish to comment further.
Yeah, I mean, my view would be that we are not into micro-regulation. So it is not necessary for us to see every short fragment of a course that you might offer which is not leading to an award. Micro-credentials is a very interesting phenomenon, and we have done assessments of providers where the micro-credentials are being put into a framework which can lead to an award. So in those circumstances, our approach again is a macro approach. We're not necessarily going to make an individual assessment of every micro component of that course. What we're interested in, at the end of the day, the student is going to get awarded a degree. In that degree should have set course learning outcomes. So there are different pathways by which the student can go through to get to the final stage of being awarded that degree, which may include some micro-credentials. So what we want to see is that the final assessment of that degree, which determines whether the degree is going to be awarded, there is a credible framework by which the assessment is made whether the student actually did achieve those overall course learning outcomes for the Bachelor of Accounting, as it might be. Whatever pathway the student has followed to get to that final point, there needs to be a credible framework for assessment of achievement. Sorry, were you going to ask a question? Or yeah, no, sorry, I thought misinterpreted. Right. Now there is. Can I just ask our IT guys, I think there are questions which are going off the bottom of the screen which I can't read. Are there any further? Again, there is a question which looks as if it might be coming from Anne-Marie. Here we go. Yep. Okay, right. So there's a question, does the response we've given regarding outsourcing of course development apply also to short courses or micro courses? Well, I think that's sort of overtaken really by my response to the question about micro courses, that we don't assess them in themselves. Yeah, there's another question. Anne mentioned that a provider should be developing their re-registration application, not their re-registration, that would be their initial registration application 2 years prior to submitting it. Actually, this is mixing up, I think, yes, initial registration and re-registration. So if the question is about re-registration in cycle 2, will there be guidelines so that a provider can effectively and efficiently develop this application? Well, essentially, the application guide that we already have for renewal of registration, a lot of the guidance in that will still apply, because the approach that we've taken, particularly to the selection of evidence that we want you to submit, is really asking you to submit evidence of your own credible internal reviews of your processes and of course the core of the core, as I often put it, of the evidence for renewal of registration is the external review of your own corporate and academic governance that you commission from an outside expert. And the report of that external review will be the core of the core. In a very low risk cases, we may not need to go very far beyond that, where that report is credible. But where we do go beyond that, again, if there is an issue about admissions, the gold example of evidence that you could submit to us is a very credible external review of your admissions policy, showing to us that the sort of issues that have been raised, for example, in the media attention about international students and English proficiency, show that you have actually addressed that convincingly yourself, rather than waiting for TEQSA to come and address that. So many of the same principles will apply. The most low-risk institutions or providers, we will probably, again, really very much concentrate on that core of the core.
Michael, can I just add to, I think the context around, particularly Anne's comments for prospective providers, having that 18-month to 2-year lead time is very much about what we see and generally what contributes towards successful applications. If we take the other end, we have seen applications come forward to TEQSA for registration as a higher education provider, and the governing board had met for the first time about 3 or 4 days before that application was submitted.
Yeah.
In our view, it would be very difficult for that provider to demonstrate that governing board has oversight over their operations. You know, a couple of hour meeting once application goes in. Higher education providers, as you well know, are complex beasts, and it's not something that you can easily get over the line in that short span of time. So the successful applicants that we've seen have generally had a longer lead time, clear evidence of that oversight and that building. They've engaged external expertise. They've often engaged consultants along the way to ensure that the final product is a quality application, and they can demonstrate to us that they're capable of delivering on what forms the basis of their application. There's not a rule, it doesn't have to be a set length of time, but our experience to date is those applications that have had that lead time have generally resulted in more positive outcomes.
Thanks. So again, are there any questions that are off the bottom of the screen which we haven't addressed? No, that's it for the questions. All right. I suppose then I would ask another question, the reverse of my initial question. What are the most common mistakes that you've seen in your time as a case manager with people submitting applications? What most commonly goes wrong? Would anyone like to address that?
Well, I suppose just reflecting on those that I've been involved, where the person responsible for developing the application and the evidence associated with that just simply misreads the intent of the particular standards. Look, I think largely the applications that we receive are generally of sound quality and evidence is appropriate, but through the assessment of the application, things will come up which we identify as not having been addressed. So that's one of those instances where we go back to the provider for additional information. Courses, again, lack of rigour in the development of the course material, no reference to external benchmarking, no evidence that there's been proper scrutiny by the academic board or the corporate board. And generally, those are picked up, generally speaking, within the assessment by the external experts. However, hopefully, if we can provide more explicit guidance to the sector in terms of the developing decision-ready applications, then those sorts of shortfalls and missteps can be overcome.
If I could just interpose before the next answer, I think with course applications, particularly from registered providers, one of the most important things that we look for is that the course is at the right level. And one of the things that worries us most is where, if we do send it out to external experts in the field, they come back with a report and they tell us that the learning outcomes are not at the proper level, or other elements of the course are not at the proper level. So in other words, if it's a bachelor degree, if they tell us that the learning outcomes are at diploma level, then that's going to really be a problem. So I would commend that to your attention when the courses are going through your own internal approval processes. Make sure that those courses are set at the appropriate level. Who was... Yeah, Anne.
Yes, from the perspective of initial registration applications, what comes to mind to me in terms of areas that applicants fall down in relation to corporate monitoring or I should say monitoring and accountability, one area in particular is risk management. both in terms of a risk management plan and how the applicant has identified the material risks to its operations and what mitigation strategies they propose to have in place. We've often found that the governing body has given little or no consideration to the material risks, and if they have, some of those risks don't quite gel with their strategic plan, their other plans. So I can't stress enough that that's a really fundamental area of monitoring accountability. I reiterate what I said earlier around the development and of the projections, that there are realistic underlying assumptions to those projections, both for the income and also for student enrolments. And also, I think Michael's articulately put the point about the course and the importance that the course is designed appropriately. Learning outcomes and assessment. We often find that the assessment is not appropriate for the learning outcomes, that the alignment is not aligned, so we don't get the mapping when we've asked for it. Yes, so they're probably the main areas I can think of. Of course, Michael touched on meeting the level. In terms of, I didn't mention earlier that in terms of a premises or a campus, we don't expect the applicant to have a signed lease, but we do expect them to have given thought to where they are going to deliver.
Look, I think my colleagues have covered it well. I might just reiterate Gary's comment of earlier about, in terms of what I'd describe as a document dump, and that does make our life difficult, which, it's not your job to make our life easier, but it certainly helps. I've seen in my time at TEQSA a application for renewal of registration dealing with all standards in totality. I believe the number of documents they submitted was 31 in terms of at the low end. And equally, we've seen some that have submitted hundreds, if not thousands. And the 31 was actually a positive decision. It was very simple. It was clearly articulated how they met the standards. So it can be done. Now, we appreciate that some might say, well, your evidence requirements, might not agree with that, but it's about being able to articulate how you meet the standard. And there isn't a prescribed way. National Code, probably slightly different. It is a very prescriptive set of standards. Threshold standards, very different. So there can be variable ways to meet it. We very much encourage people to give us the evidence that demonstrates they meet the standard. And if there are other things that you think TEQSA might like to look at, then more than happy for you to make the claim that here's how we think we meet the standards, and we can also provide on request this information. And that means, it's possible that we might never ask for it, but equally, we also know that it's there and we can ask for it on request, and that might significantly reduce the amount of material that needs to be provided to TEQSA and then assessed, and therefore contribute towards a lengthy assessment process.
And I think I might also add that there's an important difference between the types of evidence that is possible to submit for an initial registration application and the types of evidence that an already operating provider will provide for renewal of registration. Obviously, if you're not yet operating, you can't provide much evidence, if any, about operations or about how you're implementing your policy framework. The evidence, apart from the course evidence, the evidence will largely consist of the 3 Ps, as I call them, the policies, procedures, and to some extent and plans. So all of those, in a sense, can be described as we're going to do a number of things. Now, once you get up to renewal of registration, particularly if it's after 7 years, that's not really enough. We're no longer interested in what you're going to do so much as what you have actually been doing. So if you had for example, a wonderful policy framework for course review, which prescribed that you must do a whole lot of different things, and you must have peer review of assessment, and the cycle of reviews of courses of with particular specifications, has that actually been operating? Sometimes we come to universities that have a wonderful course review cycle on paper, but it's fallen into what my mother would have called desuetude. disuse over the past few years, so that's not good. When it comes to renewal of registration, we want evidence that of implementation, and that the policies and procedures have not only been implemented, but they've been implemented in a way that's effective and that meets the requirements of the standards, which, exactly as Gary said, are not prescriptive. All of the standards are really expressed in terms of principles rather than in terms of ways and means of achieving those principles. They don't even say, for example, simple things like there shall be an academic board. They prescribe there should be academic governance, and the academic governance structures and processes, whatever they are, will achieve effective academic oversight of operations, but they don't tell you how to do that. But we do need to see in renewal of registration that the academic governance processes have actually been operating effectively. And of course, for a non-self-accrediting institution in particular, one of the most important tests of that is whether the academic governing bodies, whatever they are, have been approving course proposals that come to us and have a history of being approved without conditions. Now, we don't seem to have any written questions on the monitor, so does anyone want to ask any question from the floor? Doug.
Yeah, Doug Hinchley of Kingsland Institute. Could consideration be given to case managers visiting the providers to maybe value add to the desk audit?
The answer to that is certainly yes. The simple answer is yes. For any renewal of registration, traditionally we have often undertaken a site visit, not for providers where there is no need, but very often with a renewal of registration we'll undertake a site visit and interview the key personnel. We would like to do that more, not only at the time of the site visits, but in mid-cycle, within the constraints of our budget, but that's what we want to be doing. We want to have more frequent interactions with you in various ways, including coming and actually visiting and familiarising ourselves with the learning environment and the strategic environment that you are operating in. Everybody who undertakes one of those visits for the first time comes back and tells me, oh my God, that was really interesting. I really got to understand how this whole thing works from going on that site visit. They're really fired up and they have a much greater understanding of the dynamics that you work with. So we certainly do want to visit providers more frequently. Recently, one of the team leaders undertook a visit to Brisbane and visited a number of providers that had not yet submitted, that were more in the earlier stages working towards their applications. And the feedback from that again was that the providers found that really useful, and it helped guide them in the best way to prepare their applications. So there are important things that can be gained both from an end of cycle visit and from a mid-cycle visit. So we would like to do them as much as we can, again, subject to the constraints of budget.
Michael, if I can just add to that, we generally don't conduct site visits for course re-accreditation or accreditation. However, we have conducted them where the facilities that are to be provided for the delivery of the curriculum are critical, and we've done that in a couple of instances in recent times with and also taking an external expert along to sort of assess the facilities.
We have time for one more, I think.
Thank you. Kathy Rittmaster from Macquarie Uni. In the university context, can you give us some idea of what evidence you look at when determining compliance with the professional learning standards for staff? So for learning and teaching, for example, the professional development, what will you be looking for in as evidence that we're fulfilling that?
We may not be looking for it because it's not core. So if we're taking a core-only approach, we will probably not be asking for evidence of staff professional development. That would be by exception. So if we were to ask for that, there would have to be some reason why we believe that professional development was not happening. Again, it would be a case-by-case basis. So what's the basis for that? Why do we think that professional development is not happening sufficiently? We would then try and target the evidence that we asked from you to address our concerns. Of course, staff, in any university, the number of staff is huge. So we would try not to ask a university to give us the details of staff development of every single staff member, academic staff member in the entire university. We would look at a sample and we would negotiate with the university about what that sample contained. Yes, Josh.
Just a quick question. Joshua from Siki University. What mechanisms do you have in place for moderation to remove potential internal biases at TEQSA?
There isn't a specific moderation system as such, but any particular report goes through a very complicated system of interactions and quality assurance checks and balances, and many eyes are put on that particular report. So it's not as if your case manager comes in and might have a bias and writes a report and then that gets approved. No, it doesn't happen that way. It starts with the case manager. There's an iterative process. It starts with the case manager, it goes to the team leader. Team leader wants some changes, goes back to the case manager, goes back to the team leader. From the team leader, it comes to me. I may want some changes, goes back to the case manager, from the case manager back to the team leader, from the team leader back to the director. And then if it's a registration, of course, it goes from the director to the commission. And in the case of a registration, there are also now points in the process where an individual commissioner will guide us, and we will meet with the individual commissioner at two different stages and say, this is what we see, these are the issues that we see in this application. What do you think? How are we heading in the right direction? What should we focus on? So there are many, many eyes that are brought to bear on any particular application, and there are many checks and balances in the process, I think is the way I would answer that.
All right, so in the future there will be a framework around that that's being published, or?
It's not on the books, but it would be a good idea to develop something like that.
Somebody's given me the mic, so I'll just continue asking questions.
Sorry, we are for time.
I think we're getting the wind up, so I think I will thank you very much, everyone, for the questions you've supplied us, and thanks to our panellists for their answers. And I will now pass back to Luke.